In August 1979, Modesto, California was the city just coming into its own. With a population over 106,000 and rising, it was a large city in the midst of the rural Central Valley of California. As the area's biggest city and the epicenter of activity for Stanislaus County, it was the place to be, as people not only moved to the city but would pour in on weekends to find something to do, especially teens and young adults. Massive population and urbanization can be good news for cities, but they can also bring big city problems to what was previously small-town life. And in 1979, amidst the bustle of Modesto, a series of vicious murders and robberies rocked the city, causing fear and questions. Life was changing in Modesto, and on a warm August Friday in 1979, it would reach a place previously thought safe. Welcome to California True Crime, Episode 11, The Murder of Michael Ridenour. Welcome to California True Crime. I'll be your host for this episode. I'm Jessica, and with me is Sean. Thank you for talking about this terrible crime at the heart of the episode with me.
Not a problem.
This episode takes place in August of 1979, but we struggled because it has several victims, two of whom are still living and were underage at the time, and several perpetrators who were also underage at the time. And even though they are adults now, we want to be sensitive to both victims and to the issues involved in people who are underage at the time of crimes they commit. We don't necessarily know where all the lines are in this episode, but we've given it a lot of thought. So I believe the only episode we've done other than this one that had underage victims, some of whom are still living, is our episode on Keddy, which is the case you can get a lot of information on with just a quick internet search. This one isn't really like that. But going forward, we will be talking a lot about this and taking each case individually. So for this case, we will be using full names of the main victim and the main perpetrator, but just first names for the other victims and first names for the people who are underage at the time of the crime. Do you have anything to add to this?
I think we should also bring up how the story is about Michael Ridenour, and we're going with Ridenour because we've been trying to figure out how to pronounce the last name. We thought we found it, and we thought it was Ridenour, and then a national TV show said Ridenour, so we're going to go with Ridenour. If it bothers anyone, we're sorry.
This episode is actually about a case you first told me about, Sean, and the very first one we started researching. It was also the beginning of our microfiche obsession. Where did you find this case?
I was I finally hooked up Amazon Prime on my Apple TV, and I was looking through shows to watch, and I saw that every single episode of Unsolved Mysteries is on there, so I started watching, and Season 1, Episode 8 started talking about Modesto, and I was like, oh, cool, and just because, I don't know if anyone knows, but Central Valley is technically our home. Modesto is close to us, so this was, one of those cases that it piqued my interest because it's close to home.
Yeah. There are a couple reasons this crime is important to talk about. First, as you said, it's Modesto, which we don't live in, but it's a big part of our local history, and it has a kind of fascinating history. Second is to put the spotlight on victims. This episode was difficult to research as there isn't a lot about it in newspapers, especially about the victims. Also, the place where it happens, the place where the crime actually takes place in Modesto, interested me. There are a few places that I considered home that weren't part of my home physically, but the idea of something terrible happening there is almost impossible to believe, and this happens in a place like that. Do you have any place like that from when you were a kid?
I would definitely, my grandma's house, it was, for me, it felt like it was across the whole entire city of where we live, and I technically ran away one time, but I didn't. I got mad at my family, and I walked the railroad tracks, went to my grandma's, and my parents already knew where I was going. They knew I was going to go to my grandma's, but my grandma's was definitely a safe place, and that was another thing about the whole Unsolved Mysteries. My mom would go to choir practice on Wednesday nights, and I would always be there, and the lineup for the night was Wonder Years and Unsolved Mysteries. So I would always watch it at my grandma's.
Mine was probably a baseball field. We had one, we spent a lot of time on baseball fields in general, but we had one near us, and it was a good place to go and just read or hang out. Charles, who is not on this episode, he was telling me his was a local library.
Okay.
And we asked some of our followers to share what their places were, and we got some interesting answers. We got our first answer from Brad at B. Franca on Twitter. His favorite place was in Houston, California, a place called Bud Falls. I guess they would go to a canal.
Oh, okay.
And hang out there, just drink or, I don't
At
know.
the canal?
They called it Bud Falls.
Yeah.
I think they put cans in.
I don't think Splasher would approve of
Right?
that place. Yeah.
I love Splasher. Another follower and someone important to this podcast, Melanie, at Mel Z on Instagram, said that her place was the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk.
Yes.
Which, fancy.
Yeah, well, I mean, she grew up around there, and she told me she used to go there all the time.
That's really awesome. Another person, Kathy, at Cafferdine on Instagram, hers was a church youth group. And I hadn't even thought about that all the time I spent at church youth groups.
Yeah.
That's a good one. And the Murderific True Crime Podcast at Murderific BPC said their place was the town public pool.
Okay. Is it only our town that calls it the plunge? Like, is that just like I always just thought a town public pool was called the plunge.
Oh, now we have to find out why.
Yeah.
I have no idea. So we want to thank all of our followers for sharing. We really appreciate all of our listeners, and hopefully we'll be able to get some of you more on the air. This crime takes place, as we said, in Modesto, California. Modesto is a place that even if you don't live in California, you've probably heard of it. Over the course of our lifetimes, it's unfortunately made the news many times because of some terrible crimes. What's the one that you sort of remember?
For me, it was the Laci Peterson case. It was a national case, but during it all, I was in contact and talking with people that it personally affected, and it was a big deal everywhere, but it was a big deal in this area. Just weird thing, like small world kind of thing. You knew someone that it affected, so it's always just been burned into my mind.
Yeah, I think mine might be the Chandra Levy case. I mean, it didn't happen here in California, but it involved a Modesto family and eventually a Modesto politician. And it's just something people could not stop talking about. So it's just sort of...
Right, I remember that.
Something I remember, yeah. Modesto is one of the larger cities in the Central Valley and the largest in Stanislaus County. The Central Valley is something we've talked about a few times. Several of our other episodes have taken place in the Central Valley, in their towns, both Stockton and Sacramento we've discussed. The Central Valley is a unique part of California, and economically perhaps the most important part. But it doesn't always get the love you might see other areas get. It doesn't often make it into the Visit California commercials, which is a pet peeve of mine. I don't know what you think.
Oh, I hate those. Well, I mean, I think I brought it up how it's like, if you look at the commercial, it's like, oh, look at our beaches, look at our hot dudes. That's not California. So that's like one tiny section that costs a lot anyway.
And there's so much more to see.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And it sits literally in the center of the state and in a valley, as it suggests. The Cascade and Tehachapi and Sierra Nevada mountains line its east side, and the California coast and the San Francisco Bay are on the west. The basic setup for people who don't know in many of the counties in the Central Valley, and certainly in Stanislaus County, is that there's one or two larger cities surrounded by farmland and then many much smaller towns. Modesto is the largest city in Stanislaus County, and if you live in one of the smaller towns around it, like we did growing up, it's the place you would go to get basically everything done. Did you guys often go to Modesto?
Yeah, I mean, you would have to go to the mall unless for like anything, and because there was no name brand you just had little 5 and dimes in the small towns around here. So Modesto, even though it felt like it was a big city and it was more ahead of its time than the smaller towns, it was still just going to Modesto.
Yeah, we were the same. Modesto's population started to rise during World War II as it became a center for the war effort, with factories and agriculture being transported in and out. In 1950, the population of Modesto was 17,389 people, but by 1960, the population had doubled, but would really explode during the 70s, and by 1980, over 100,000 people would live in or around Modesto. This is a huge population boom in a relatively short period of time. And to give it some context, this is a 68% increase in the population in just a decade. For comparison, the fastest growing area in California from 2010 to 2017 was the San Francisco, Oakland, Hayward area, and it only experienced an 8% increase. And more recently, Sacramento was named one of the fastest growing cities in California, and its percent population increase from 2017 to 2018 was 1.4%. So this is really fast. I mean,
that's a huge difference. 68% to 7 years and 8% increase in the Bay Area. That's, crazy how fast it grew.
Yeah, I can't imagine what that was like for people.
Yeah, it's so many new people.
Yeah. There are many reasons Modesto urbanized so quickly. There's a lot of job opportunities. There's canneries and factories. It also sits on Highway 5 and Highway 99, and they run north and south along California into major population or economic centers, so people are commuting. Amtrak has a stop in Modesto, and also people leaving more rural areas, the littler towns all around, for opportunities and the chance to live in a city or something more like a city, more like it than their smaller town. However, urbanization can have both positive and negative sides to it, especially when it's happening this quickly. On the positive side, as a growing economic center, Modesto's economy also grew. Not only are people moving to Modesto, but people are spending their weeknights and weekends there, and more visitors mean more money is being spent. Just a few of the draws to this booming city included Vintage Fair Mall, which you mentioned, and had only been built in 1977, and was the only mall of its kind in this area. A handful of movie theaters, including Brixmore Theater, and in August of 1979, when this case takes place, was playing movies like Life of Brian, The Amityville Horror, and Apocalypse Now.
Also, I just want to bring up, because Vintage Fair Mall also had a theater, and it was, towards the end, it was doing $1.50 movies, and my friend Zach and I went and saw Good Burger 3 times in a row, just because it's probably the worst movie, which is the greatest movie. But I love those $1.50 theaters, and it was Vintage Fair Mall
That's
theater.
an interesting decision. It was the one. It was outside the mall, right?
Right. I think it's Dick's now. Dick's Sporting Goods.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It was falling apart. You go pay $1 and sit and just
and watch Good Burger. Which
But one of the biggest draws to Modesto was cruising culture, which was captured in the movie American Graffiti and included driving up and down Modesto's downtown streets. But by the 1970s, cruising had been moved to a street in Modesto known as McHenry, a major thoroughfare and a street where a variety of activities are centered. Did you cruise?
I did once or twice. It was McHenry, and you couldn't go 5 miles an hour like they used to. You still had to kind of speed up, and then you're yelling at people out the window, and then you park if you could flag someone down, and then I was just scared. So I didn't like doing it.
Yeah, McHenry is a street that goes through Modesto. It has several lanes, and so a really common thing to do as kids was to drive, or as teenagers, was to drive down it. And there's kids from cities all around Modesto as well as from Modesto, and you kind of just yell at each other and I guess meet boys. We probably did it way too often.
I met girls.
Yeah. And I think it was actually illegal by the time we were doing it.
Yeah, but we weren't. It wasn't like we were just yelling. That's why we would stay the speed limit. It wasn't like cruising back in the day where it was seriously. It was like the Will Smith "Summertime" song. You drive 2 miles an hour so everyone can see you, kind of thing.
Yeah, and as I said, the movie American Graffiti is about this. I've never actually seen that movie. Have you?
Yeah, I watched it. I might have watched it too late. It was okay.
And George Lucas is from Modesto, so we'll probably mention that a couple more times.
Yeah.
And just to give you an idea of how much Modesto catered to people coming in from smaller cities, I talked with my dad, actually, who would go with his friends to Modesto during the 70s. And on Friday or Saturday nights, they'd hit McHenry, go to movies. There's a bunch of movie theaters. But they'd also go to Straw Hat Pizza, which by the time we were old enough was called Shakey's. And apparently at this time, Straw Hat is split up. It has a family section, but it also has a separate teenager section. So young adults spending time in Modesto is really sort of ingrained into Modesto culture. But urbanization can have negative consequences as well. Things like housing issues, an increase in poverty, homelessness, crime, gangs, and just stress on social services like hospitals, fire, or police. Even now, Modesto's crime rate is larger than the rest of California. And people didn't only come to Modesto for fun things. You often went there because it had better hospitals or doctors, better, more up-to-date facilities. All of this change can be a lot, psychologically. New people, new places, big changes can cause a lot of anxiety for people. It's very stressful, and people will often start to blame their problems on these changes, whether they're connected or not. In 1979, all of these changes in Modesto, as well as the feelings of anxiety, come to a head when the city and surrounding areas experience a rash in violent crimes. By August, Stanislaus County had experienced 11 terrible murders, and 5 of those were in Modesto. These murders were so vicious and terrible that people in the area had become very scared. And none of these murders were connected in any way, but it sets the entire town on edge. To give you a better idea, some of the murders included 2 men who were murdered after work at their cannery jobs in Modesto. Police believe those murders were caused by a sniper bullet, so that's very scary to people. Also, the murder of a cattle rancher just outside Modesto really shocked the area. This man was shot on his property, and this hits home for people as there are so many ranchers and farmers. There were several more, but the one that really scared people was a robbery, murder, rape case that led to the arrest of 4 Modesto teens who had brutally murdered a young couple. Luckily, their son had stayed the night elsewhere. These same 4 also brutally beat someone the night before in Newman, which is a very, very small city outside Modesto. The local newspaper, the Modesto Bee, ran a story with families who were so afraid they were all sleeping together, locking their doors and windows, keeping weapons with them for protection at night. So the mood here in Modesto is people are frightened.
Right, and I think one thing that you always read in when it comes to sleepy towns or a small town murder is that people finally started locking their doors and windows, which your dad was over and I was talking to him about this, and he remembers growing up, he did lock his doors. I've always locked our doors. So I'm just not sure. Maybe it's the community, maybe it's the area that people lived in, but I mean, we didn't grow up in a nice neighborhood, so we locked our doors at night. So I don't know. That statement always bothers me when I hear it in newspapers, but I just thought we did see it in these these things.
That's what people are saying, but
yeah.
And my dad grew up in a very small town outside of where we live. I mean, less than 100 people probably.
Right, and he's still locked
in the middle of
doors.
Nowhere. Yeah. So I don't really know what's happening there. So all of this fear and change, as well as crime, comes to a terrible intersection on the night of Friday, August 17th, 1979, at 11:30 p.m., when a 17-year-old high school student named Michael Ridenour, who was visiting his family in Modesto, went to Downey Park with his friend and a cousin. Downey Park is a 20-acre park in 1979 in Modesto, and it sits at 1200 Brighton Avenue. Downey Park is located directly behind Downey High School. Downey High School is the second oldest school in Modesto and named after Thomas Downey. It's also where George Lucas graduated high school, and I guess it's meant to be the high school in the movie American Graffiti, though I read that it's called Dewey High School.
Well, yeah, like Downey, where it sits on Coffee, like the entrance, there's also Fairmont, and if you were heading south on Coffee, and Downey High's entrance would be to your left. If you took a right on Fairmont, and then you would take a left, the next street or the street after, and it's Ramona is right over there, and that's where George Lucas's house that he grew up in was right there by Downey. So
the park is large, and it has a baseball diamond, picnic areas, it has play area for kids, soccer fields, tennis courts. I visited the park a while back, and it had several teams of kids practicing football. It's really a beautiful park, and we'll put some pictures up on CaliforniaTrueCrime.com and probably tweet them out as well, so you can get a sense of what it looks like. Michael Ridenour had been living and going to school in Carpinteria, California. Carpinteria is a small seaside town in Santa Barbara County, and it's about 336 miles from Modesto. In Carpinteria, Ridenour was on the football team, and he had traveled with his friend to Modesto for the visit. This friend, Steve, was also just 17 years old. Michael Ridenour has a very large family and still does in Modesto and around the area. Many of them are actually in law enforcement and local politics. And I'm not sure exactly how they're related, but the man who started Daryl's Storage, his name is Daryl Ridenour, and that's a big thing around here. There's tons of them. They all say Daryl on the side. And I didn't know it's technically the first self-storage unit in the country.
Oh, wow.
Started in the 60s.
Yeah, I just remember the one on Claus Road. There was it was a sign, and it said Daryl Storage, here we grow again, and then there was a water fountain later. It was that sign, here we grow again. Constantly see it, because to get Modesto, Claus is a very large thoroughfare?
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, here we grow again. Daryl's storage.
We would always pass them as kids and then have elaborate stories about who we thought Daryl were. And so finding out was interesting.
Yes.
That Friday, Michael Ridenour, Steve, and Michael's cousin Kirk decided to hang out together at Downey Park. As I said, the park sits on Brighton Avenue, and there are a lot of houses and apartments that surround it now, as well as another section of park directly across the street. So there's the big park and then a street with apartment complexes and stuff on the other side, and it's kind of like a littler park over there. The papers say that at the time the area was going through a lot of construction, so some of those places were just being built. There was a lot of construction going on around Modesto in general, just because of how many people are coming here. Brighton Avenue also connects directly to one of the larger streets in Modesto. Its name is Coffee Road. While Brighton Avenue is more of a residential street, Coffee Road is much bigger and busier. Even in 1979, it already had 4 lanes and connected different parts of town.
Yeah, Coffee's goes all the way through Modesto. It goes from to Scenic, which is pretty much one side of Modesto, all the way to the main highway in Riverbank, which is a different town. So it's just a really long road, and this is more towards the south side of Modesto.
And it's part of a system. Modesto is sort of laid out like 2 grids, and Coffee Road, there's a lot of other bigger roads that connect to it. And this will become important as our story continues. At 11:30 p.m. that Friday, the 3 boys were at Downey Park. They had done what kids all over the country have done before them and brought beer and were hanging out in the dugout along the first base line talking. As they were in the dugout, 3 men approached them. The men were wearing dark clothes and ski masks, except one who was also wearing a military fatigue jacket and carrying a Colt AR-15. The 3 men had walked up a pathway along the backside of the first base line from Brighton Road. At 11:30 p.m., it would have been very dark coming from that direction, as there are no lights, and the lights in the ball field were not on either. As they neared the boys, one of the 3 men yelled at the boys to, quote, "Get your wallets out, give me your money." The boys didn't have any money, so they offered the 3 men their beer instead. Michael Ridenour then stood up in the dugout and said, quote, "Get out of here, we don't want any trouble." The boys would later tell police that they thought the gun that was being carried was a pellet gun, which would explain why they stood up to the 3 men. As soon as Michael Ridenour finished speaking, the man with the gun opened fire on the boys. At the time, there were no restrictions in California for obtaining an AR-15. And the history of gun laws in California actually goes back to 1917, when concealed carry permits were first released. While there weren't a lot of laws that had been passed, most of them had to do with handguns, mainly because some of the other guns hadn't been invented. And interestingly, most of them involved waiting periods, but were aimed at specific groups. For instance, in 1924, there are some gun laws aimed at restricting the use of handguns by Hispanic and Chinese populations, which after you and Charles talked about all the specific laws aimed at the Chinese population and racism in California, this didn't really surprise me.
It doesn't at all.
The law the men were breaking at the time, even before they started shooting, is called the Mulford Act. Under this law, it's illegal to openly carrying a weapon in public that is loaded, unless you're a member of law enforcement. This law was passed in 1967 and signed by Ronald Reagan, who was governor at the time, and it was also aimed at a particular group of people. So prior to this law, there was nothing making it illegal to carry a weapon, fully loaded, as long as it wasn't concealed. In the 60s, Black Panthers were patrolling Oakland carrying loaded weapons and doing something called cop watching, which is actually something we see a lot of now in social media. Basically now it's taking video, being a witness to police behavior, in the hopes that doing so can hold police accountable for their misconduct. In the 60s, it meant patrolling the streets with weapons in an effort to protect yourselves from police, who they did not see as protecting their community and as a danger to them in general. California history was made when Black Panthers marched to the Capitol in Sacramento when they were working on the Mulford Act. These Black Panthers were armed with guns. They marched in support of their constitutional right to bear arms, as well as to protest a racist law. This was a completely peaceful protest, and when they went inside the Capitol, Capitol Police disarmed them without any issues. But an addendum was added to the Mulford Act to fast-track the bill after that event, and even mentioned the Black Panthers in the addendum. Reagan supported the bill and signed it, and even though it was passed with a specific group in mind, it applied to everyone. So when these men in Modesto are carrying an AR-15 around and it's loaded, this is a crime, and it was a misdemeanor at the time. But carrying it around unloaded wouldn't have been a crime.
Yeah, it's just so hard to. What do you do? Like, I'm wondering if the cops, people carrying around guns, did they check every time to see, or were they only checking certain people that they thought?
Yeah, they probably go into specific communities
Right.
looking for specific things, is what I'm guessing.
Yeah.
And hopefully, like now, I don't think it's too common to see somebody walking around with this type of weapon.
Well, I just don't. I don't see. I feel like our area is very conservative, and Second Amendment is talked about a lot, but I don't just see people walking around with guns everywhere, though. Still, so
yeah, which is why I think perhaps these boys didn't think too much of it when they saw it. As the bullets were fired, the men ran back the way they came into the park. They ran back towards Brighton Avenue and crossed onto the other side of the street. Brighton Street is in a kind of J shape. It curves around the park, and where the men crossed would be at the bottom of the J, with Coffee Road at the top. They crossed over to where a sidewalk lined with backyard fences of houses sitting on a street called Lavender Lane, a street just one over and perpendicular to the park. They ran along this sidewalk toward a court surrounded by houses called Carnation Court. As they ran, one of the people living in a house on Lavender Lane reported they heard a loud bang against the back fence, as if something had been thrown against it. The men would reach the end of a court called Carnation Court and jump over a little grassy area to get to the court. Once in the court, they instantly moved from being in the park to being inside a residential area. Waiting for the men on the end of Carnation Court is the vehicle they came in, a 1971 El Camino. If you've never seen an El Camino, it's about the size of a station wagon, but with 2 doors and 2 seats and a bed like a truck.
Yeah, it looks like if you cut the back off a stretch limo and put a truck bed in it. It's a weird car.
The paper actually refers to it several times as a truck.
Yeah, but it's a car.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Don't know. If anyone's listening and want to have the new online fight, is an El Camino a truck or a car? We can do that.
According to witnesses, the 2 men who were not carrying a gun jumped into the cab of the El Camino, and the man with the gun dove into the back. As the car started, a blue dome light inside the El Camino came on, and the car made a roaring sound as it screeched down Carnation Court. But I should say, it doesn't have to go very far. It's just a court, and then right there is Lavender Lane. Mm-hmm. They drive their tires smoking, their headlights off, and they turn right onto Lavender Lane, the same street they ran along the back to get to the vehicle. They speed down Lavender Lane until they reached Wiley Drive. Here they made a quick right turn, which took them directly back to Brighton Avenue, right in front of the park. They took another right on Brighton, drove the length of the park until they reached Coffee Road. This is where Coffee Road, being such a large street, comes into play. Once these men made it to Coffee Road, they were instantly connected to all parts of Modesto, other large streets, for instance, as well as the freeway, depending on what streets they take. So using this street, the men disappeared into the night, although some witnesses say they sped north. At the park, police and ambulance arrive on the scene, and what they find is horrifying. Michael Ridenour, who had stood up to the robbers, was already dead in the park. One of the bullets from the AR-15 had entered his brain, and he instantly died. His friend, who had come with him from Modesto, from Carpinteria, had been shot twice. Both bullets entered his left side, one near his ribs and the other in his left leg. He's immediately taken to Memorial Hospital Modesto. Memorial is one of 2 hospitals, and it's also on Coffee Road, and about 1.2 miles from Downey Park. Doctors removed partial copper-jacketed bullet fragments from him at 12 a.m. that night, which is an amazing job by first responders. The boys were confronted by the men at 11:30, and by midnight, this young man's in surgery. So that's really quick. After his surgery, he's in satisfactory physical condition. The third boy, Kirk, isn't physically injured by the gunmen. Both he and Steve lived through the event, but this is a very traumatic experience. And while the paper often uses the words, they're okay, they weren't hurt, because they weren't murdered, the truth is being shot at or being in such a horrible event, the things you see, leaves emotional injuries. Meanwhile, police start to investigate the murder and attempted murder of these boys. There are many witnesses, the boys who lived, the people in the neighborhoods who saw them escape, but the men were wearing masks, ski masks, and dark clothing, and it's dark outside, so there aren't sketches released as there might be in other crimes we've seen. None of the witnesses can say what they look like. And there are things like weight and height that can be described, but that's just a place to start. And it alone isn't really helpful in a city of over 100,000 people.
It's really hard to guess anyone's weight, height, things like that, and especially if it's dark. Another thing, though, it might be easier if in a traumatic situation, everything might be so extreme or your senses heightened that you might actually be able to do a good job. But it's so hard with those sketches or anything like that.
Yeah, I think witnesses have a difficult time just in general of knowing those things. But like you said, the heightened situation. And at the same time, your adrenaline kind of crashes at the end of these events. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to even trust your memory.
Right.
In the park, police find 19 bullets. And at some point, they narrow down that the gun shot bullets in 3-round bursts. They also find that Michael Ridenour only had $6 in his wallet at the time of the murder. This new crime adds to people's anxiety in Modesto. It's senseless. It's happening to young men just hanging out in a ballpark, a thing many people have done, especially around here, and can put themselves in that position. If you add the fact that there is not a description of the men, or if police have any idea who did this, they're protecting that information. It isn't widely available, which we should say in many cases happens for good reason. And I don't know if that's happening here, but often investigators keep information to themselves. But it sets the public on edge because they don't know that. And this is just such a terrible crime, and people are already anxious, so it creates more fear. In the area, a resident who lives nearby the park tells the Modesto Bee that on weekend nights, the park would be a place kids would go to, quote, drink beer, smoke dope, break bottles on the sidewalk. And I just want to say, there's nothing in the paper to suggest that that's what these boys were doing. I mean, they were obviously drinking, but that they were up to anything, that they were doing drugs, or that there was even anyone else in the park at the time. So I just want to kind of make that clear.
Well, yeah. I mean, that just seems like the neighbor who he hears everything. I don't think the Modesto Bee was, front page news, broken bottles on the sidewalk every night. It's just this guy. It's this guy.
But I do think it helps people psychologically to think this is something that happened for this reason or that reason. These kids were just getting into trouble. Mm-hmm. And especially because Modesto was already dealing with these other violent crimes. And this case is interesting in that there isn't a lot of newspaper coverage about the crime, which is surprising because Modesto is 100,000 people, but there's not a lot going on. It's just kind of surprising that there's not just more articles about it.
Right.
But the articles do include a lot of people's reactions, and a lot of these have to do with the changing Modesto. In particular, I'll read a couple quotes. A woman who didn't want to be named said, quote, I guess 15 or 20 years ago, things like this only happened on the wrong side of the tracks. But our culture has changed. There's more violence all over. Still, you never think things like this happening in your own neighborhood. It really sinks in when it happens just around the corner.
Yeah, and this quote, if you read it right now, you see it constantly in the paper. I don't think this is a quote that will happen every year, and it will always say 15 to 20 years ago. People can't, it doesn't change. It doesn't seem like. There's always more crime, and it always happened on the other side of the tracks. But this quote, it's just funny to see this in a paper from 1979.
And I think we've seen it in several of the cases we covered.
Right.
1900, whenever.
It's always the same quote. Yeah.
This is the second one I found interesting. It's from a man who was watering his lawn. Quote, nowadays, you almost expect stuff like this to happen. It's not exactly new, and it's going on everywhere else. So I think, it just shows how... I think there's a good reason for people in Modesto to be... There's so much change that has to affect them.
Right.
And this probably wouldn't have happened maybe around the corner before. I don't know. But it's also, like you said, common.
Yeah.
The police continue to search for the men who murdered Ridenour, but this is not a case that is finished quickly, which is actually probably the norm. The police ask for help from the public, and the Modesto Bee has a program called the Secret Witness Program that puts forth award money for tips about crimes. They offer $2,500 and also urge people to come forward. Eventually, that offer for information would increase to $5,000. As we said, Michael Ridenour is related to several members in law enforcement, and at the time his uncle is a detective in Modesto. His name was Richard Ridenour. The paper notes how personally he took this crime and how hard he worked to find the men who committed it, even when working on his off time. which I think if I was a police officer would obviously do.
Yeah, I think you kind of have to as a police officer.
A year and a half goes by, the police working tips and trying to investigate the case, and finally some information the police received through the secret witness program leads them to 3 men, all from Modesto, and all teenagers themselves when this crime happened. I don't know what the tip was exactly, but I do know it had to do with the vehicle that they fled in. On January 30th, 1981, news breaks that police are finally able to make some arrests in this case. The first to be arrested, a boy named Jacob, who often goes by the name Jay. He's 18 years old when arrested at his parents' home in Modesto. This means that at the time of the crime, he was either 17 or 16-year-old, depending on when his birthday falls. He was from Modesto and a dropout of Bayer High School. Bayer High School is also in Modesto and a little over 2.5 miles from Downey Park, where the murder occurred. Jacob is booked into Stanislaus Juvenile Hall. At the same time, a second arrest is happening across the country in North Carolina. In Fayetteville, North Carolina, there's an Army training facility called Fort Bragg, and police track down a young man by the name of Mark Adams. Adams is from Modesto as well, and in 1981 he is 17 years old and had been serving in the U.S. Army at Fort Bragg for the last year, where he underwent basic training. The police moved to arrest him as they believed that Adams was the young man holding the gun during the attempted robbery and the man who pulled the trigger. At the time of the crime, he would have been 16 years old. Mark Adams refuses to come back to California, so the detectives have to draw up an extradition order. Detectives from Modesto had been to North Carolina to interview Adams, but those detectives don't have any power under the law in North Carolina, so extradition is required to ask the state under the Uniform Criminal Extradition Act, which all but 2 states have passed, to send him back to California.
I had no clue that there was anything like that. I always just thought, like, if you're in the United States, you can just get pulled from anywhere. I didn't know you'd actually have to ask just from crossing state lines. I thought that was only like the safe countries everywhere else.
Yeah, and I think generally you'll only get sent back if you're in the state if you've committed a felony. Mm-hmm. States aren't going to worry about it if you've committed a misdemeanor. And it's interesting to me that 2 states haven't passed this.
Yeah, that's weird too.
Both Jay and Adams are held without bail and charged with murder, attempted murder, and attempted robbery. Things get a little unclear here. There were 3 people involved in the crime, but there isn't a lot of information about this third person in the newspaper. I'm not entirely sure he's ever officially arrested, but the police know who he is and he's interviewed, brought in, or whatever you want to call it, but I don't think he's ever actually put in handcuffs. His name is Terry, and in 1981 he is also 18 years old, meaning at the time of the crime he was about 16 or 17, depending, again, on when his birthday falls. The gun that was used in the crime is a Colt AR-15, and it's also found by police. The gun was found in the possession of a biker gang called the Bar Hoppers, who are still around today but had a large presence in the 70s and into the 80s. It's a group associated with the Hells Angels. There are several chapters of this organization, but one of the biggest is now in Merced County. According to the 1%er encyclopedia, 2 of every 100 people in Merced are a member of this group. And I had not heard of this group. I didn't know if you had.
No, I haven't heard of them before this.
Sheriffs found the gun when they served several search warrants on various homes of members of the Bar Hoppers. I don't have an exact date for when the gun was recovered, but it's before they make arrests. They did not find the gun in Modesto. They actually found it outside Stockton, California. Stockton is in San Joaquin County, and if you remember the Emma LeDoux case, that's where it took place. It's about 30 miles north of Modesto, and it's a quick trip between the 2 cities since they both sit on Highway 99. Stockton is also a large town, just like the rest of Central Valley, with little farm towns around it. So I'm not sure exactly where in San Joaquin County they found it, but it's probably not that far from Modesto. The warrant was not specific to this gun. That isn't why the sheriffs were there. The sheriffs had a warrant after a robbery had occurred and were specifically looking for a stolen motorcycle, as well as other stolen or embezzled property or things used as the means of committing felony, property or things which consist of an item or constitutes evidence which tends to show that a felony has been committed or tends to show that a particular person has committed a felony. According to an appeal, it appeared the sheriffs who served the warrant, while not looking for the weapon used in the Modesto murder, had been told by the Modesto police that a gun they were looking for might be in the possession of the Bar Hoppers. They were asked to keep an eye out if they were ever in the home of someone belonging to this organization. The Colt AR-15 that was used to murder Michael Ridenour was found wrapped in a newspaper with another gun during the search. What I don't know is why the police suspected, or in this case knew, the gun might be there. It may have come from the secret tip line, or perhaps one of the men involved in the crime told them. It's just something we're not sure about. However, when the trial starts in December 1981, there are a few things that offer more questions than answers. First is that the only person to go on trial in this case in Stanislaus County Superior Court was Mark Adams. As I said, the police are sure he's the one who pulled the trigger the night of the murder, and it turns out that Mark Adams had also purchased the weapon, though he says that he purchased it for his stepfather. Also, both of the other boys, Terry and Jacob, tell police that Adams was the person who had the gun during the attempted robbery and murder. In fact, Jacob takes a plea deal. He pleads guilty to 3 counts of attempted robbery and 5 counts of robbery. In exchange, he testifies against Adams and is sentenced to 8 years and 8 months in prison. As part of his plea deal, the murder charge against him is dropped. During the trial, his testimony alone will take about 1.5 days.
So you bring up how it's attempted robbery, but then also 5 counts of robbery. And before all this, there was a slew of robberies that were going on. So obviously they linked it to these boys.
Yeah, we'll talk about it a little further when we talk about what Adams is charged with. But in the week or so following up to this murder, there were other robberies in parks with basically the 3 men, the whole thing, the same exact situation. The third man, Terry, who, as I said, there is far less information about, and there's not a lot of information on any of this, but really nothing about Terry. He testifies against Mark Adams and also says that Adams is the one with the gun the night of the crime. But he doesn't go to jail in a plea deal like Jacob. He's given immunity and put into the federal witness protection program. I found this very strange. Nothing about this case to me jumped out. Someone would need to be protected or put in witness protection. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, it's just weird. But I mean, it's also late 70s, early 80s. It seemed like everyone was put into any movie you watched. They all got a Hawaiian shirt and a mustache and went somewhere. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it was just like the thing that they did.
Yeah. So I looked into witness protection. Federal witness protection is not a very old program and was only codified in law as part of the Organized Crime Control Act of 1970. And for obvious reasons, there's very little information. They're trying to protect people about how the program works. But it does sound like it works a little bit differently than it does in movies.
Okay.
People who are put into witness protection when they are whistleblowers and often against gangs or the mob, that sort of thing. Most people in witness protection have committed a crime. The man who started the program, his name is Gerald Schur, estimated that less than 5% of relocated witnesses are innocents who haven't committed a crime. And in the 1970s, like you said, the program does seem a little bit looser. They're putting people in there that maybe you wouldn't get in today and doing things for these people that they wouldn't do today. For instance, a former mob hitman entered witness protection and asked the government to pay for his wife's facelift and breast implants.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, they did that.
Yeah, that's nice.
So, yeah.
But now that you read that, it might be because of the bar hoppers. I mean, considering it's a gang, not so much mob, but they might have loosely put it on that.
Yeah, it might have to do with a case not necessarily connected to this one, but just similar.
He gave
something.
information, but gave information on something else that we don't know about.
Yeah. As I said, the program changed over time and became stricter. So, and fun fact, a California fun fact, I guess a huge portion of the people who were put in the witness protection in the 70s and 80s were placed in San Diego.
Weird.
Right?
Yeah, because why would they stay in California?
I don't know. I don't even know why you'd put them all in one place.
Yeah, that is odd.
So if you're ever in San Diego, take a look around.
Look for Hawaiian shirts and mustaches, and you'll be set.
Some states even have their own. California is one. It doesn't get its own witness protection until the 80s, but the paper specifically said federal witness protection. Mark Adams goes on trial in December of 1981. He is charged with murder, attempted murder, and attempted robbery for the 1979 crime, and he's charged as an adult. Trying juveniles as adults is not uncommon in the United States, specifically when the crime in question is this serious, murder. And in the 1970s, many states made it easier to try juveniles as adults, California as well. And in California, currently there is a law prohibiting trying anyone under the age of 14 as an adult, but anyone 14 and above can be tried.
14, that's a freshman in high school.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, they become an adult for some reason. and can get tried as an adult. California, that does not seem like a very progressive law to me.
No, probably not.
Yeah.
And in 2000, the voters passed Proposition 21, known as the Juvenile Justice Initiative, and it gave prosecutors the ability to decide if someone would be charged as an adult. And as we said, that would be people aged 14 and older. I believe prior to that, they would go before a judge who would decide if they were, I guess, ready or if their crime demanded they be charged as an adult and have a whole case. The law also makes it clear that if a juvenile has committed certain crimes, like murder or murder with a special circumstance, so like in this case, murder with a robbery, they are automatically adjudicated as adults. Mark Adams grew up in Modesto. He had a large family and never really knew his dad. Growing up, they had little money, and in an article in the San Francisco Examiner, it said that his stepfather was abusive. He graduated from high school and joined the Army, as we said. He is also charged with committing other robberies in various Modesto parks. It turns out that before the night in Downey Park, there had been several other robberies in parks with the same described modus operandi. 3 men, all dressed in dark colors, wearing masks, and one man wearing an Army fatigue jacket and carrying a gun, walked up on other people and robbed them. Again, these people couldn't identify the men as they never saw their faces, but they did provide police with descriptions of height, weight, hair color for hair that was kind of untucked underneath the masks, that sort of thing. This makes the testimony of the other 2 men who say they were with Adams very important, as is the fact that the gun belonged to Adams. Adams pleads not guilty and denies any involvement in the crime. During the trial, both Jacob and Terry testify that Adams was the one holding the gun during the murder of Ridenour and during the other robberies. However, they both say that the murder wasn't intentional. After they left the park, Adams told them it was not his intention to actually hit any of the boys, but instead to shoot over their heads. And I don't know what you think about this, if it would sway you as a jury member, the intentionality of it all.
I don't know, because being on a jury when somebody was a kid would be very hard for me. So let's say as an adult, if he was an adult, that wouldn't have mattered. I mean, you shouldn't have shot in the first place, especially in 19 bullets with 7 times, the spurts. But being a kid, it's hard to figure out what I would do on a jury.
Yeah, they should probably not let you on that
No,
jury.
They should not let me on a jury anytime, because it's like one little thing that an alien could have done it. If I believed in aliens and the defense attorney said, well, aliens could have, I'd be like, reasonable doubt.
And we should say first-degree murder, which generally includes premeditation, can also include someone who acts with extreme recklessness. So despite the fact that he didn't, even if we believe he wasn't intentionally trying to shoot him, obviously shooting an AR-15 over the top of some boys' heads is pretty extreme reckless. Their testimony also made me curious about the gun, and since I don't know a lot about weapons, I talked with our expert here at California True Crime, Ben, who we hope to have on very soon, and learned a lot about the weapon. I've mentioned several times now that the gun that was used was a Colt AR-15 semi-automatic rifle. It's described as a lightweight weapon. Witnesses describe the shooting of bullets from the rifle as coming in 3-round bursts, and when the gun is found, it is fitted with a mechanism that shoots bullets in 3 rounds. And what this means is that every time the trigger is pulled, the gun shoots 3 bullets, one after the other, and then stops. So you have to pull the trigger again for another 3 bullets to be shot out. As we said, the police found 19 bullets in total. In order for there to be 19 bullets, the person shooting the gun had to pull the trigger at least 7 times. This also means that for whatever reason, the gun wasn't fully loaded with 21 bullets, or police didn't find 2 bullets, which happens. It's a large park. Bullets can fly. It's certainly possible. But why is this important? And I guess it goes to what he was trying to do, the intentionality. If you were trying to scare somebody by shooting over them or near them, you might just pull the trigger once. But once I found out that someone had to pull the trigger 7 full times, it felt far more intentional to me.
Oh, yeah. And I understand. It seemed very intentional for, a robbery and him shooting that many bullets. I think just my whole argument, which just bothers me, is that he was a child. And it's just really hard if I was on the jury. But definitely, you don't just shoot. You don't pull the trigger 7 times saying you're shooting over a head. I don't know. But
And I'll link a video of someone doing this on YouTube. It still goes very fast, but the action of pulling it, I guess depending on how it was set up, seems intentional. Stephen and Kirk both testify about the night in the park. Those were the two other boys that were with Michael Ridenour, as well as others who had been robbed. At trial, Mark Adams would testify on his own behalf. He admitted to purchasing the weapon, but testified that he had bought it for his stepfather, and that after he gave it to him, he didn't see it again. He also said that he had alibis during the time of Michael Ridenour's murder and for one of the robberies. During the Downey Park murder, Adams said he was camping, and during one of the robberies, he said he was at the movies. His defense also presented testimony corroborating these alibis, but the newspaper does not say what kind or how they corroborated, and the jury that is interviewed afterwards never brings it up. So I don't know if they just didn't believe them, or if it wasn't like we definitely saw him, or you could prove it with like a movie ticket or something.
Right, like the camping, unless you like had a receipt for a camping site or something, right. It's hard. It doesn't seem like it was someone else testimony saying I was with him, because that just seems... Yeah. It would be brought up more.
Yeah, it'd be believable.
Right.
Yeah. However, his main defense was that Terry and Jay were lying when they testified against him because of the deals each received. A man named James Crowfoot also testified. Crowfoot was a cellmate at one point with James and testified that James told him Adams was not involved in the crimes, but that the prosecutor had offered to drop the murder charge if he testified against him. So the basic defense here is that according to Crowfoot, James was lying when he testified and would only do so because he didn't want to be charged with murder. As the trial ends and the jury deliberates in January 1982, Crowfoot's testimony would highlight something the jury struggled with while deliberating. Basically, who to believe. And it reminded me of when you and Charles talked about this in the Little Pete episode, when I believe someone testified against him and he had been in jail.
Yeah, the robber.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know how this uncommon it is. It's definitely something we see all the time in movies and on TV. But I think the jury has to decide who they believe.
Yeah, I think it's just, what we talked about in the other one, I think it matters on how the person comes off, the person that is supposedly the snitch. What are they in jail for in the first place? And if they're getting like a reduced sentence or something like that because of their testimony. I think there's just so many factors that go with it.
Right. And I couldn't actually find anything about James Crowfoot, so I don't know why he was there or what kind of person he was. After a 5-week trial, the jury deliberated 6.5 days. The jury was made up of 8 men and 4 women. During their deliberation, they ran into several problems or questions, and one juror afterwards would say, quote, "Several jurors said this was the hardest decision they ever had to make in their lives. They are 11 of the finest people I ever worked with, but there were times when tempers wore thin, and at one point we felt we might not be able to reach a decision. We kept going over and over the testimony." Some of the issues they had to work through included witness testimony. Witnesses who were robbed in general gave similar descriptions about what the men wore, but conflicted on height and weight, hair color that they could see, and hair length that they could see, of the men wearing the jacket and carrying the gun. So this gave the jury enough doubt that they weren't sure that the same man of the 3 kids always wore the same jacket and the gun, or at least enough doubt to think it wasn't Adams carrying the gun each time. And this goes back to us talking about witnesses just sort of being bad at witnesses, which makes sense.
It's just hard because a lot of times I think you're trying very hard and you might actually be making up things in your head.
Yeah.
How you think it might have been, because it's at first sometimes it's memories that you don't need, you don't think are important, and then you're putting them together and it just might be wrong. So it's just hard.
It's a lot to ask people, and I don't know if these happened at night, but if they did, like this other crime, that's just asking a lot of witnesses.
And I don't think it's like the witnesses aren't trying to do bad things.
No.
It's just hard to remember anything.
Yeah. The second issue, and a big one for the jury, is, as we said, no one can identify these 3 in general, but especially no one can say for sure who was holding the gun. And the jury is not sure what to make of the testimony of Jay and Terry during deliberation. And the jury actually asks the court reporter to read the court testimony of Jay and his old cellmate, Crowfoot. This rereading took at least a full day, and it just shows that there's conflict for these men on who to believe. On January 8th, 1982, the jury would announce its decision. It found Mark Adams guilty of the first-degree murder of Michael Ridenour, as well as the attempted murder of Steve and Kirk. He was also found guilty of attempting to rob the 3 boys, as well as 5 other men in 2 other parks in Modesto. All of these robberies happened within the week before the murder in Downey Park. Adams is only convicted of armed robbery in the Downey Park case. The differing accounts in the other robbery cases caused doubt among the jury about who was holding the gun. In the case of the murder of Michael Ridenour, the jury was swayed that Adams was carrying the gun because of the testimony of Steve and Kirk, and it matched the testimony of Jacob and Terry. On February 4th, 1982, Mark Adams was sentenced to 43 years to life in San Quentin Prison. An appeals court reduced that sentence by 8 months in 1985. It seems the original court added too much time when they added consecutive weapon enhancements and sentences for the robberies and murder when they shouldn't have. So his time was reduced by 8 months.
8 months. It seems like nothing when you already have 43 to life. That's just weird. 8 months.
Mark Adams was sent to San Quentin Prison, which is located in Marin County, outside San Francisco. It's about 100 miles from Modesto. San Quentin is a prison we've talked a lot about before. It was where Emma LeDoux was sent in her original sentence, though it no longer has a female wing. Taylor Heltzer was also sent there in our episode on Children of Thunder. And Lee Chuck went to San Quentin in our episode on Fong Little Pete Ching. And I imagine we'll be talking about San Quentin a lot in the future.
Oh, yeah.
It's also a famous prison. It houses the only death row in California. There's been several movies that highlight the prison, including Animal Factory in 2000 with William Dafoe, Edward Furlong, and Danny Trejo, who you told me was actually in San Quentin.
Yeah, I mean, he's had a record, and now he owns a taco shop in LA, too.
The Lincoln Lawyer with Matthew McConaughey and was, I guess, about San Quentin. And Dark Passage with Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. And this movie, Bogart actually undergoes plastic surgery to change his face, which I just thought was fun because it's such a common trope now.
Like he had plastic surgery? Oh, in the movie.
In the movie, yeah.
I never saw it. Just like every other movie we talk about, I haven't seen any of these movies.
Yeah, we should probably have Charles more on because he's seen them and I haven't.
When you read that, I just thought he actually had plastic surgery.
No, not the actor.
Okay,
the character had plastic surgery.
Yeah.
San Quentin is also famous because a lot of famous people have been there. As we said, Danny Trejo. Famously, Johnny Cash did a whole album that was recorded live at San Quentin in 1969, which I think his more famous one is from the Folsom. Yeah. Merle Haggard also sang many songs about the time he spent incarcerated in San Quentin for robbery. And most of the people listening to this have probably heard of Ear Hustle, the podcast where inmates of San Quentin share their stories. If you haven't heard of it or listened, definitely check that podcast out. San Quentin is also a very, very large prison that sits on the edge of the San Francisco Bay and is 275 acres, the actual prison. And it's the oldest prison in California. It was built in 1852 and took the place of prison ships off the coast of California. It has several sections, as I said, although it's a much different prison now than it was in the 1980s. It has a death row, and in 1982 it also had a maximum security area and a minimum security area. So this prison is just really huge. We will put a map up on our site so you can better understand how big it is and how it's laid out. When Mark Adams is sent to San Quentin, he's put in, the paper says general population. I believe in the maximum security area. I've gotten some conflicting information on this, so it's a little unclear. The maximum security is surrounded by concrete walls and more prison guards than are in the minimum security, but Mark Adams is still able to leave his cell and do things around the jail. According to the prison, he takes every work opportunity possible in an effort to stay out of his cell. At the prison, Adams is able to learn new skills, like cooking, and he takes classes in a vocational program in computers and electrical engineering. He also has a job working with computers in the prison academic department. He is described as a model prisoner. In fact, the warden describes him in a letter as a, quote, hard worker. He's neat, dependable, cheerful, and works with little or no supervision. It's a pleasure to work with him. While in the Army, Adams had also become a born-again Christian, and he continues that in prison. All of that changes on June 10th, 1986, when San Quentin prison guards do their afternoon check of the cells. When they check Adams' cell, they discover that he is not inside, and no one knows where he is. They lock the prison down and start to go cell by cell, but the guards don't immediately assume that he has escaped the prison. As we said, San Quentin is very large. and there are a lot of places inside for him to be hiding. In fact, other inmates have gone missing only to be found days later camping out somewhere inside the prison. In 1986, the prison is undergoing significant renovation. Being the oldest prison means it needs a lot of updating, and Adams isn't watched at all times, so there's plenty of time for someone to slip away unnoticed and hide under a building or near somewhere under construction. The other thing that makes them think that Adams is still inside the prison is that they learn that before he goes missing, he had spent $135 prison dollars at the prison canteen on candy, chips, and other goodies. None of these items are found in his cell, and when other people had gone missing inside the prison, they also bought food items to take with them, kind of to keep them going. Although none of the prior escapees had the amount of food he had purchased with them in the cantina, so guards surmised Adams couldn't camp out much longer. One of the other men who had done this before, who went missing, had far less food and was gone only for 3 days. Even though they think Adams is inside the prison, they do alert police in Modesto in the unlikely event he made it outside, and just in case. He did have family in Modesto, so it was possible if he did get out, he may contact them. San Quentin sends out a special emergency response team called the Cert Squad. The Cert Squad is made up of prison guards, and I believe every prison has one of these squads. They're specially trained to do certain tasks. They still work as everyday prison guards, but they are always on call to be activated if the prison they work in or even another prison needs them. And what I read said they were volunteer positions, which would indicate to me that they don't get paid extra, but I hope that's not the case, because they go through a lot of training.
Well, yeah, I think like if you work in a school system, you kind of have to know CPR.
Yeah.
I would consider that a volunteer position. You probably don't, you hope you never have to use it. So
what I can say, there are levels of CERT training. So I think there were like 5 or 6 levels.
Oh, okay.
So I think they must go to trainings and things like that. So it's hard for me to believe they don't get paid extra for it and have to be on alert at all times.
Yeah.
Not just any guard can become a member of a CERT squad. They're highly specialized positions, as we said, and it's required to have good physical abilities and weapon abilities, for instance, to just even qualify. But they are used in situations when guards aren't enough. So hostage situations, riots, high-risk prisoner transfers, and in this case, the recapture of escapees. So the CERT squad, along with security dogs, begin to search through the prison. The prison is so large and there are so many places to hide that this is not an easy or quick task. About 8 days go by and they still have not found Mark Adams. Adams's family is notified that he's missing from his cell. They haven't had any contact from him, and according to the newspaper, they actually believe he wouldn't have tried to escape, and they worry that perhaps something has happened to him in San Quentin, maybe even he had been murdered. After 8 days, the possibility that he's escaped the prison entirely starts to seem more reasonable. They haven't found any traces of him, no paper, no wrappers. Along this line of thinking, it seems possible that instead of eating the food he had purchased in the prison, that he might have sold it to inmates for cash, like actual cash.
Oh, that seems smart.
Yeah. If other prisoners had bought the food items with the money they were hiding in the jail, then they think he might have gotten about $50. And that money is a lot more useful to him than snacks if he was able to leave San Quentin. But if he did manage to get out of the jail, they don't know how. The Cert Squad and dogs eventually stop their search, and they begin to accept that Adams is no longer inside the jail, that he has actually somehow escaped San Quentin. On November 16th, 1988, an episode of Unsolved Mysteries airs, highlighting the escape of Mark Adams. This is the episode that you talked about at the beginning. And they're hoping someone will recognize him, maybe come forward. All of the original run of Unsolved Mysteries are on Amazon Prime, so if you want to check out the episode with Mark Adams, it's episode 8 of season 1. According to this episode, the last time Mark Adams was seen the day he went missing, he showed an authorized pass at a checkpoint that gave him permission to enter a part of the prison to see the dentist, and the guard let him through. The warden also theorizes that Mark Adams escaped in one of 3 ways. First, the most obvious but least likely is that he somehow climbed the outside concrete walls of the prison and just went over. This seems basically impossible for many reasons, but many of these walls are constantly watched by guards, and it would be an easy thing to climb. It wouldn't be an easy thing, actually, to climb unnoticed. Also, and the show doesn't mention this, but San Quentin is bordered on 3 sides by the bay, so getting to freedom after climbing those walls would be very difficult, and if you climbed in the other direction, there's just a lot more prison to get through. 2, Apparently, there are about 225 vehicles going in and out of the prison every day in 1986. So it seems possible that he may have found a place to hide in one of those vehicles. Again, these go through more than one checkpoint, but if he found the perfect place to hide, it may have happened that way. And the last way, they think, the way that seems the most likely, is that he changed into civilian clothes at one point and just walked out with visitors or workers. These people visiting have to go through at least 3 checkpoints, and 2 of those checkpoints people have to show ID. So again, this would be very difficult to do, but not impossible. And in fact, this is the way another prisoner, a man named Michael Joseph Sanchez, who was convicted of child molestation, broke out. He hid near the prison chapel, changed into civilian clothes, and then walked out with a crowd of employees. And I actually trying to find out if he had ever been found, and I couldn't find anything, so I don't think he's found.
Did it say how this guy had civilian clothing, like at the chapel? Did it say anything?
Michael Sanchez?
Yeah.
No, it didn't say how he got it. That was I found that one in the newspaper.
Oh, okay.
So I'm not sure. Although I do think it's possible that they might know more than they're saying,
Right.
and aren't going to tell people. They don't want to give anyone ideas on how to break out of San Quentin.
Right.
And in fact, I saw a lot of people. There were several cases of people breaking out of San Quentin, which even Unsolved Mysteries talks about it like a fortress you can never get out
Right.
of. And I'm not saying it's
but
easy.
like how like on Unsolved Mysteries, I thought how he's like climbing pipes and jumping like he's a world-renowned rock climber.
Yeah, parkour.
Yeah, exactly.
Nothing comes of the Unsolved Mysteries episode, and several years go by with no hint at where Adams might be. In 1993, America's Most Wanted aired an episode where they highlighted Mark Adams' story and asked for information from anyone who might recognize him. I don't know which episode of America's Most Wanted. We couldn't find it. We couldn't find it on YouTube or reruns.
We can't find any reruns of America's Most Wanted. So if anyone has like a VHS collection that they want to give us, we would love that.
Well, I feel like it would do well to do some like Unsolved Mystery does, some updates, but I don't know. On the night that this episode aired, Michael Ridenour's uncle, Detective Richard Ridenour, who had worked very hard, as we said, to solve this crime, was taking tips on the tip line for the show, and he picked up the line and received a tip personally that would actually lead to the capture of Adams, which I thought was kind of amazing.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
The caller said that he recognized Adams and that he was working as a computer specialist for General Electric in Humacao in Puerto Rico. The person claimed that Adams was living under the name Michael Jacobson. As it turns out, Adams was living in Puerto Rico and had married a woman named Laci Diaz. Diaz was actually working at San Quentin while Adams was there. She was supervising a prison work program, and after they met, they fell in love. When he escaped from prison, he hid out at her apartment in San Rafael and then eventually made his way to Puerto Rico. A year after he escaped, Diaz quit her job at the prison and also moved to Puerto Rico, where they married and created a life together.
The civilian clothing and walking out seems a little more believable with this story of her.
Yeah, and you had someone on the inside, right?
Yeah, I know someone who actually worked the case, I guess, and they pretty much told me, he got some clothes.
So she brought it in?
Yeah, and was able to walk. He was able to walk out.
Did she also bring an ID?
I don't know. I mean, I didn't hear, but it seems he would probably need it. Yeah, like make one or something.
On July 16th, 1993, Mark Adams was arrested in Puerto Rico. Adams and many of the people he knew in Puerto Rico fought his extradition from Puerto Rico back to California. His friends and neighbors also held candlelight vigils and tried to plead with the governor of Puerto Rico to not extradite him. Adams had turned his life around in Puerto Rico. He was considered an esteemed member of society in the town he lived, was very active in church, counseled young people in custody on weekends, and offered to donate his kidney to a neighbor's daughter. Adams would also say that if he went back to jail in San Quentin, he, quote, "I will be a dead man." Nothing he says is specific about the kind of threat, so I don't know if this is like, I can't go back there, I'll die, or he knows someone wants to murder him.
Or he doesn't want to go back. It was the worst part of his life. It could have just been self kind of thing.
Yeah, he couldn't handle it himself.
Right.
I will say a few months prior to him going back, his stepfather, who was in jail at San Quentin, dies.
Oh, okay.
In what they say is a suicide.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know if maybe he's just freaked out.
What was his stepfather in San Quentin?
I don't know. I couldn't find.
Okay.
Despite the appeal of friends and neighbors, a judge in Puerto Rico sent Adams back to San Quentin on September 24th, 1993. The governor of Puerto Rico said that he didn't have any legal recourse to keep Adams from being sent back to California. The one thing he could have done, according to newspapers, was request that Adams be kept in a jail in Puerto Rico once he answered for his crimes. So he would go back to California, plead guilty or whatever, and then they asked that he be held in Puerto Rico. In the years between when Mark Adams escaped and when he goes back, San Quentin has made some large changes. Because of its age, other prisons had opened in California and had far better facilities. So San Quentin had basically stopped being a maximum security prison. It still keeps death row, but all of the other maximum security prisoners have been moved to other prisons. So people like Charles Manson had been sent to other places. I talked with someone who works inside the prison system who said that San Quentin often acts now as an intake facility for maximum security prisoners. So if they do go to San Quentin, it's just for a short time before they head off to the place they're actually meant to be. And it's just kind of, I didn't realize San Quentin had changed so much. It's often just this sort of badass prison.
Right. I mean, it's still, you think of San Quentin, you think of San Quentin. So
yeah,
it's still the name, I think the name reigns high still.
And Adams is sent to San Quentin for what is supposed to be a brief time before he's sent to Pelican Bay Prison, which is called a supermax prison and is one of the most secure prisons in the United States. However, Mark Adams would never make it to Pelican Bay. While at San Quentin, Mark Adams was being held in an administrative segregation unit. He was being held here as he was a flight risk. He had gotten out of San Quentin before. But also in the 1990s, and actually until pretty recently, these units were something being used more and more. I'll put some pictures up so people can see what they look like. And if you're interested, 60 Minutes just recently did a really interesting piece on the administrative segregated units at Pelican Bay. It aired on July 22nd. And it gives a lot of insights into the practice of holding people basically in isolation or in solitary confinement. And some of those people were held for decades. So Adams is being held in a cell, a very small cell, by himself, but lined up or near other similar cells. And I said the reason is that he's a flight risk. He's also near men on death row who are being held like this, and others who are there for various reasons, sometimes as punishment. And during this time, it would often be because they were just associated with gangs. They were trying to stop prison fights. When you're in those cells, you're extraordinarily restricted. You have no physical contact. Adams isn't allowed mail or visitors. He can't even have a Bible, which is something his lawyer brings up. And you spend all of your time in this cell with the door closed, except for, I think, an hour a day. I don't know what the ones in San Quentin look like exactly, but if they're anything like the ones I showed at Pelican Bay, the metal surrounding you makes it very difficult to see out. You, as I said, are allowed an hour a day of exercise in a yard, but this yard isn't a big yard. It's just a little bit of a bigger room than the cell you're already in. The night of March 6, 1994, Adams would have words, at least according to men in cells nearby, with a man in the next cell over, whose name is Paul Green. And 1 to 2 days prior to this, Adams had also told his mom that he was having issues with a man named Paul Green and another inmate and was worried for his life. Witnesses on the night of the 6th also say they heard the men decide to meet in the exercise yard the following day. I couldn't find any information on Paul Green. The newspaper said that he was a dropout of the Black Guerrilla family, and if it's true, then he was affiliated with them in some way. It might explain why he was being held in administrative segregation. The Black Guerrilla family is a prison and street gang. It's an African-American gang that was originally part of the Black Power movement, but eventually turned to crime. And it has a very unique history and directly involves San Quentin and California, and I'm hoping we'll be able to do an episode all about that. The only other thing the newspaper said about Paul Green was that he had a history of mental problems. This comes up again and again in the articles I read. And I mention this not because I think it's particularly important, but because we've talked about language before and how it can be used to shape or, drive how we see things. And so I think it's really important when something is just thrown into the paper like this with no context. It's just kind of frustrating.
Yeah, especially just mental problems. That doesn't explain anything at all.
No, it's just so vague. And second, there's no indication, there's no context at all. So there's no indication that whatever is happening with this person, with Paul Green, has anything to do with what happened, or if it has anything to do with why he's in administrative segregation. So part of me didn't want to mention it, but I think it's an example here of how language can affect how we see crime or mental illness, prisoners in general. On the morning of March 7th, 1994, Mark Adams and Paul Green were strip searched and then let into the exercise yard at 8:50 a.m., and according to guards, Adams immediately attacked Green. Now, I don't know why they were let into the yard together. My understanding was you would go in alone, but someone told me that guards can make that choice if they want to. I don't know what you think.
Sounds a little suspicious.
Yeah.
I mean, check them and then put them in together when they were already, I don't know. It seems odd.
Yeah. Timothy Scott Reynolds is one of the prison guards who's around the unit, and he is in the guard tower approximately 25 feet away from the fight, so Adams has attacked Green. He blows his whistle several times to get the men's attention, and then yells for Adams to get on the ground. The two did not stop fighting. This same guard then thought he saw something shiny in Mark Adams' hand and thought he had a knife. He shot 2 warning shots into the ground, and when the men still continued to fight, he trained his bullet on Mark Adams and fired. The gun was loaded with fragmented bullets. Fragmented bullets are bullets that fragment on contact. The reason they're used is really similar to the reason hollow points are used. The fragmenting helps eliminate collateral damage. So it would hit the person or thing you're shooting at and then just fragment, not go through or hit somebody else. According to him, his intention was to shoot Adams in a non-lethal area of his body, specifically through the leg, but he hit him in the ear behind his head. At age 31, Mark Adams was killed in San Quentin. There was never a knife found. Green only suffered some minor cuts and scrapes. And this leads to some questions. According to the prison spokesman, Don Lindsay, quote, "Prison policy is to shoot to wound, not shoot to kill." And for me, I'm not a marksman of any kind, but I don't know how hard it is to shoot the person who's moving, who's fighting, even if you're an expert at this.
Yeah, I mean, I've fired a gun like twice in my life, but it seems hard to just shoot to wound if they're fighting, moving around, and I don't know.
Yeah. While the prison said the shooting was justified, it did bring up several questions that other people and cases had been asking about, specifically about prison conduct. Apparently, California prisons were some of the only prisons allowed to use live ammo when carrying guns on site, and often used those weapons instead of other methods, like tear gas or batons, when breaking up fights. And it will turn out that there were prison guards just outside a gate on the ground with batons when the fight between Adams and Green occurred. And this is a quote from the San Francisco Examiner in a 1998 article. Steve Fama of the Prison Law Office said, quote, "Between 1989 and 1994, state prison guards fatally shot 28 inmates, state records show. That's more than 3 times as many as in all other U.S. prisons combined."
Yeah, that's kind of ridiculous. 5 years, 28 inmates shot to death, just in California.
Yeah, those stats kind of speak for themselves. I mean, I'm not a prison guard,
right?
So I
no,
don't
I understand.
know,
I'm not saying it's an easy job, but
yeah.
But to have 28 inmates die because of a shooting from the guards, that's
a lot, yeah. After Adams' death, Mark's family sued the California Department of Corrections for wrongful death. During the civil trial, a woman who had been the girlfriend of the prison guard testified that he had bragged about the murder of Adams. In December of 1998, a federal jury awarded $2.3 million to Adams' family. The jury denounced the use of lethal force and said that Reynolds used excessive force when he shot Adams. And this case wasn't the only one over the years that awarded money to members of inmates' families after they were shot in a prison in California.
Who actually pays the families?
So what I read said that it came from the guard as well as the person in charge of the prison.
The warden?
Yes, thank you. I could not think of his name. And there was a third person. I don't remember who.
But it's not like our tax money?
I don't know. It made it seem like it came from those 3 people, but I don't know if there's some setup where the judge can say these 3 people are responsible, but California ends up paying them, or if they pay directly, because it's a lot of money. So I don't know what happens.
They might not have gotten all of it.
Yeah, that's true. In 1994, an inmate named Preston Tate was also killed in a very similar manner at Corcoran Prison in the Aggregated Segregation Unit, or the SHU. Corcoran Prison is in Kings County, which is about an hour south of Fresno. The state settled in that case, but it turns out the FBI was investigating that prison for taking prisoners of the SHU who were often enemies or members of rival gangs and pitting them against each other in fights that were watched and bet on by guards. This is what happened to Tate, who was pitted against rival gang members and then shot to end the fight. In 1998, an independent panel found that 24 shootings at Corcoran were not justified. And my understanding is that while the case was specifically about Corcoran, this was happening in other prisons as well.
It sounds very similar to what happened.
After these cases and some investigative reporting done by newspapers, the California Department of Corrections changed its policy to further restrict how and when guns are used. Although, when I talked to the person who I know someone who works in a jail, the description of how something like this, a fight between two people, would be handled sounded exactly the same. And
like nothing's changed?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I can't speak for all prisons, but
right.
It sounded suspiciously similar. In March of 1994, Adam's body was returned to Puerto Rico for burial. His family from California attended the funeral, as well as his wife in Puerto Rico. Everything I read said it was a very big event. More than 500 people attended his funeral, including the mayor of the town he lived in. And there was a long procession with children carrying white carnations.
This whole story is just kind of, everything is sad about it. You have a child killing another child, if you want to call it a child or a kid or a teenager, and then he seemed to turn his life around, and then he did escape, which is kind of cool. But then they get him, and then it's just a sad story, and he gets murdered while he's there, and it's just nothing. I don't know. There's like no justice. There's nothing that really happened, and it's hard.
It's a hard one for me because it sort of feels like the beginning crime is. It's not covered very well. We don't know anything about the victims. And it's sad to see someone else get talked about. And then the original victims really, because all three of those boys suffered. And I can't imagine what the other two have gone through. But they sort of get forgotten to this larger story. And it's just, like you said, there's just nothing about this that feels, I don't know.
Well, like even just the unsolved mysteries. You have like 3 minutes on the actual murder of Ridenour. And then it's more about how did he escape?
Yeah.
That was all that anyone seemed to care about.
This was a difficult case to research and read about. Like many crimes, there's more information about the person who has been convicted of the crime than the person who was murdered. In many ways, the murder is just the beginning to the story we laid out, but it's very important to remember that the 3 young teenagers suffered a horrendous and terrible crime, and one paid the ultimate price. These boys who are participating in a rite of passage had their lives ahead of them and took a terrible detour. All of the people Michael Ridenour knew and loved suffered, and all of the people he would have known lost out on not knowing him. He deserves to be remembered, as do the victims who lived but who suffered unimaginable emotional scars that are hard to quantify. But this crime, as we said, isn't easy. It happened in a place that in the 70s was experiencing great change, and the people who committed this crime, in the midst of the great change of entering adulthood, made a decision that would also derail their lives. It's hard not to see how a few different decisions might have meant an entirely different path for all 6 of them. In the end, 2 people, with very different lives, would share an all too similar end. Thank you for listening to this episode of California True Crime. And I really want to thank Sean for joining me. Do you have any last thoughts?
No, thank you. It was, for how little there was, you did some good research, and thanks for putting it all together.
And we want to thank our listeners for checking this episode out. A big thank you to our weapons expert, Ben, and of course to our quality control engineer, Melanie Duncan. If you want more information about this episode or to talk to us or others about any of the cases we've covered, be sure to check out our Facebook page and our group. You can always get more information from us on Twitter and Instagram at Cali True Crime. And if you've listened to this or any of our episodes and would like to give us a review, we would really appreciate it. This episode has been produced at Chateau Walnut.